Hi, it is already November 2nd. It's our 8th class together. Today we're going to be talking about SOGI 123 and about learning disabilities in school settings. And so, well, just sort of an introduction to learning disabilities and supporting learning disabilities. We'll talk about them more as we go along. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to today. Today we're going to be talking about SOGI, which is the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity programs within school curriculum in BC. And we're also going to talk a little bit about learning disabilities. So I know that in the original schedule, it says that we're talking about FLASH today, F-L-A-S-H, which is also a sexual health program. That is something that has popped around to different places within our curriculum as the EACSW program, and we've sometimes housed it in 156, and last year we housed it in 160. So this year I wanted to bring you something that was school specific. And so kids in our schools these days are learning about sexual orientation and gender identity through the integration of the SOGI program. And it's not really a program in that it doesn't have a curriculum, but it's a way of looking at sexual orientation and gender identity and how they're using language around that in the school system. So I wanted to sort of jump in today and start with sharing with you what that can look like. So hopefully this is what you're seeing today under November 2nd. Should say SOGI 123 and an introduction to learning disabilities. And here in our book is this week's PowerPoint. And I've already got it loaded here so that we don't have to wait for it. So SOGI is an acronym. It stands for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. And this is sort of what schools in BC and Alberta are using in the publicly funded schools to talk about teaching of sexual orientation since about 2016, when the language of our Human Rights Code in BC changed to include the protection of trans individuals and those with various gender identity or expression. So using SOGI sort of aligns us with that code, so that because schools have a legal obligation to be an inclusive and diversity encompassing space. Good. Woo. Okay. So the idea behind SOGI is that it allows kids to see that there's different family structures, and it opens up language around the LGBTQ community and what different families can look like in different cultures and different places. It teaches about sexual orientation and gender identity at a curricular level. So kids in kindergarten aren't necessarily talking about gender identity on a level that kids in grade 12 are talking about it. I'm just gonna let somebody in, there we go. At a kindergarten level, say, there might be a book that somebody reads at story time that has a family with same gendered parents within the story. So it's really looking at talking to kids at the age that they're at and incorporating all these pieces into everyday curriculum. So kids will be talking about things within language arts, they'll be talking about it in mathematics, they'll be talking about it in library, they'll be talking about it in social studies, so that it's not something that's taken out necessarily and talked about in one room. When I was in school and I did my first sort of understanding of sex ed in school, it was probably 1981, 1980, and the girls were taken to one room and the boys were taken to another room. And I don't know what happened in that boy room, but in our room, we got shown a film and given a booklet, and in the booklet it said, "It's wonderful being a girl," and it went through different things about menstruation, and once a month the egg will travel. You know, who knows where this egg is? Once a month, that's great. How does that relate to me? I don't know. But one of the things it said is when you have menstrual cramps, to make sure you try a different shade of lipstick because it'll make you feel better. And when I think about that now, there's so much inherent gender stereotyping that is embedded within that. understanding. And so that was my first public school social space sort of exposure to the idea of my own sexual identity and myself as gender and what gender expression can look like for somebody who was in one of those two rooms. So very binary, right? Boys in here, girls in there. And that's very different now. Talking about all of these different concepts happens in all kinds of spaces. It happens on the playground, it happens in the hallway, and then it also happens in classrooms. So I'm going to share with you a little video, and of course now I have to try and throw the dice of the lottery of screen sharing again to make sure I get the sound. And I see somebody wrote something in the chat. Oh, great. That's great. Thanks, Lisa, for sharing that. And I'm just going to show you the introduction video that is out there on the interwebs for parents about elementary level SOGI. Okay, and let's see if it's going to play for me.
Having SOGI discussions in my school made me feel like people were educated about different families, like mine, where I have two moms. Now I don't really feel like if I talk about my family, anybody will tease me because everybody's educated.
BCCPAC is working with the Ministry of Education to create parent resources to explain what SOGI inclusive education is in BC schools. SOGI 123 is one of the tools teachers can use to better understand the diversity in our schools, to better understand sexual orientation and gender identity, so that they can include themes and weave it into the teaching that they have.
SOGI Inclusive Education is something that is not on a standalone program. It starts great conversations with our students, and it allows them to see that everyone brings a different piece to our classroom.
Gender will always be part of life. Most people feel primarily as a boy or man or a girl or woman, but what we're trying to do is just to create a little bit more space because there are people in the world who their biology or their gender identity doesn't necessarily fit neatly into these two rigid boxes.
Support for diversity in schools is legally required by the BC Human Rights Code. This code helps protect all of us from discrimination and harassment.
We're diverse, and so our ideas that you can turn things into black and white are actually not the way it is in this world. It's not a true reflection of God's diversity, and it's something we need to get past so that we're beginning to think of everybody as being unique and different and wonderful and beautiful.
ਮੈਂ ਹੱਥ ਜੋੜ ਕੇ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਕਰਦੀ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਜਦੋਂ ਬੱਚੇ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਪਰਿਵਾਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਆ ਉਹ ਪਰਮਾਤਮਾ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਤੋਹਫਾ ਮਿਲਿਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਆਪਣੇ ਲੜਕੇ ਤੇ ਲੜਕੀਆਂ ਦੀ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਪਿਆਰ ਦਿਓ ਇੱਜ਼ਤ ਨਾਲ ਘਰ 'ਚ ਰੱਖੋ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਪਿਆਰ ਕਰੋਗੇ ਆਂਟੀ ਗੁਆਂਢੀ ਕਰਨਗੇ ਸਾਰਾ ਆਲਾ ਦੁਆਲਾ ਕਰੂਗਾ
A lot of people will say being in touch with this information will give people ideas, but that wasn't the case for me. Not having SOGI education didn't prevent me from being queer or being transgender, just made me confused and afraid and ashamed.
We know from our research and from other people's research that heterosexual students benefit just as much as students who identify with different sexual orientations and gender identity. So if you create an inclusive environment for one group, you end up creating an inclusive school for everybody.
My advice to parents would be to listen, ask questions, talk to your kids. If you're worried about how it's going to be integrated into the classroom, talk to the teacher. They're the ones going to be integrating it, so talk to them about it. Listen with an open mind.
Teachers have our conversations in their classrooms in age-appropriate ways all the time about diversity and how kids in their classrooms are represented.
SOGI inclusive education in elementary school looks like classrooms and libraries having a variety of resources, books, posters that show diversity, show diverse families.
The way I approach these topics with early primary students often begins with a book. It starts with a story, for sure, and that's a really natural way to talk about it.
There's people that are boys, there's people that are girls, there are people whose gender might be a little bit of both. All girls like playing with dolls. Is that a stereotype?
Yeah.
Is it true?
No.
No. Boys don't cry.
What?
Girls don't play sports.
What?
That's ridiculous. Of course they do.
Some boys like dressing up, some girls like catching snakes.
Who's in your family? My dog. A family can be made up in many different ways. Don't be afraid to start with the younger grades. They are definitely ready to learn about, there aren't just two boxes, boy and girl, there's everything in between, and there are different types of families, and the kids are old enough to learn about that, to be accepting of each other's differences.
You know, and they're in my class, they're 12 and 13 years old. Okay, so we're gonna pause for the middle part, and you can write down some thoughts about how you think the character is feeling. Parents have reacted to SOGI education in a very positive way. I've had people come up and talk to me about it, how they're happy that this is happening here at our school. I've had emails, and they're very supportive.
It's really important to face your fears. As I'll say, I was a little bit scared at first. What does this mean? I don't know. But it's okay. It's okay to feel that way. And it's okay as long as you acknowledge that fear.
And for once, it didn't keep playing. I'm so excited. So I'd love to give you a chance to just sort of talk about this for a few minutes, just in the context of, you know, my experience was this binary experience. I definitely bring that as my background, as my first exposure to this idea in a public space. That doesn't include what my family talked about or my family's belief systems or anything like that. But I brought that with me through the door too when I went to that classroom and I got to get that It's Wonderful Being a Girl book and got to read about lipstick, you know? So I'd like to give you a little bit of a chance to talk about gender identity, sexual orientation, and maybe the way that you, at the age you were when you first came across this in a school setting, or maybe you never did in a school setting, to sort of talk about that for a few minutes. So I'm going to put you into breakout spaces. And I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to just talk about this for a little bit. And I'd love to hear what you have to say when we come back. So that'll be interesting for some of you who are just out of high school. So this is something that you were talking about really recently in that setting. And for others of us, we've been out of school for a while. So this might be different for you. I'm curious, what did you talk about?
Okay. We had quite a variety of people in our group with a bunch of different experiences, so it was really cool. We all had a different piece of knowledge or sat and listened and learned. But yeah, we touched a bit on how different it is from when I was in school, which wasn't long ago because I graduated in 2019.
Yes.
So, but compared to when Shelley was in school, because that's what she said, even though I think she's like 27. So, but something that was relatable was that when I was in grade 5 and we did our first sex ed course, we got split up. And it was females and males, and they completely like blacked out the library so you couldn't see in there, and we weren't allowed to talk about it after. So it was like, yeah, so I just have such a vivid memory of that. But then once I got into like around grade 10, it was like we were the guinea pigs, and we were exposed to everything, and we were all together, and kind of like hit us fast. But yeah. And then I went to an alternative school, so I saw a lot and experienced with a lot and was friends with a lot of people that were LGBTQ. So
Interesting.
I don't know.
So our group was like, I think most of us had, in general, it was mostly, we had the separated classes of boys and girls. And one of them had like the principal actually came in to do the talk kind of thing, which was uncomfortable. And so I know that kind of sets for me, that would set a tone for how your sexuality at that point, right? And then I spoke a little bit about my kids kind of thing, because my daughter is going through so she's in Redfish right now, and she's in grade 6, and in grade 3 they start sex ed, but it starts with personal care. It starts with like washing your armpits. It starts with like, I know my body kind of thing. And so I brought out some of my sex books, and I've got these books that I have in the bathroom. This is my kid's bathroom reading. And so my daughter, for the first couple of years, was totally into the girls' book, and now she's grade 6 now, and she's totally into the boys' book, because having that separation and not being able to talk about things I'm making fun of you, I'm gonna make fun of you kind of thing. And so now she knows how to make fun really well.
Giving her all the ammunition.
I've also got like sex is a funny word, which is like it brings up different ideas about the word sex. And it so for instance, like, you know, like one of the first questions in the book is like, what is sex? And so it's like, when you come out of your mother's womb, you have a penis or you have a vagina, so we sex you kind of thing. And so it just starts off with like that kind of thing, as opposed to intercourse or something, right? Which is funny. And then I also have Talk Sex Now, which goes grade by grade, what your kids should know these days. And this is all, I did like a 12-course adolescent sex thing through the Neufeld Institute.
Oh, awesome. So
yeah, totally. Ask away. I also did the course with Liz Amaral and the author, with the assisted author for the book kind of thing at the Waldorf School 1 year. So
very
I almost know it all.
And for those of you who aren't familiar, Liz Amaral is a wonderful person who is a great resource in our community for families around all kinds of things, especially things that relate to Neufeld and sort of that connectivist way of looking at parenting. And she is available to talk to people, come to classes. She goes to school meetings with families. She goes to IEP meetings. She's amazing, and she knows everything there is to know about Gordon Neufeld and sex that you could ever want to know or ask. So yeah, lovely. Oh, great. Tiana's disconnected with Liz. Excellent. Yeah, she's quite a powerhouse. I'm so excited to have her. She's in the School District 8 area, so she's available. I don't know who her parallel person would be in School District 20, but I'm sure there is somebody. And if anybody knows, please let me know, because I'd love to be able to share that information on. Echo.
Hi.
Hi.
Another thing that I thought was, when I was in school, I was also, really similar to Maddie, because we're just a year apart, but like we were separated into different rooms, blah, blah, blah. This was in grade 7, and like taught like some really vague basics, I guess, about your period and this and that and blah, blah, blah. And for a really long time, I felt like now when I look back, I'm like, it might be inappropriate to educate kids on something, like as a principal, a male principal, about women's bodies in that case, just because I went for 10 years thinking I was normal, but I actually have endometriosis, and I feel like that's like a big thing, like diagnosing time for my disorder, whatever you want to call it, is 10 years. Wow. Because women aren't educated like about what's really supposed to be happening and what's really not supposed to be happening. And like I think that still is happening. Like those numbers are right now. So
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that there's an expectation of pain, and there's not really an understanding where that pain might be, or what normal looks like in terms of bleeding and all those kinds of things. Absolutely. I think that stuff is still being quite vaguely taught. And I don't know if that's because there's just such a wide variation of health that people are not sure how to approach that, or if that's because they don't understand that crossover into something that might need extra looking at, like something like endometriosis. Yeah. Endometriosis is when the uterine lining starts growing in places that are not the uterus. So it can mean that the uterine lining grows in different organs in the body, or it can end up growing in different parts of the like fallopian tubes or on ovaries. So places that it can't be shed from in some cases. And so it can cause a lot of pain and compaction of different effect on different organs. Like if it grows on the in the fallopian tubes, it can cause swelling and different things there. And it can also mean that somebody might not be able to conceive a baby, because if they don't have the proper lining for that embryo to adhere to or to attach to in those early stages, then they may not be able to have a viable pregnancy or host a viable pregnancy in their uterus. Yeah, that's sort of my quick, how am I, Echo?
You're totally right. It's
okay.
Kind of like it can also grow on like your lungs. Like
Yes.
it doesn't stay just lower abdomen. Like it can really get everywhere. So
yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad we could go into that. Yeah, so that's one of those things that wouldn't be talked about necessarily in one room or another, because I don't think we talk about sexual I don't want to say illness, but it's like things that can affect our bodies negatively, unless we're talking about sexually transmitted diseases or STIs. So those are the things that we talk about in those separated rooms and sometimes in those joint rooms, but we don't always talk about the things that systemically can happen for our bodies. And so, you know, when I think about this, and I think about the students that we support, sometimes we end up in very frank conversations with students because we have a relationship with them in the classroom, from supporting them through math, through reading, through their social lives in the ways that we do, or through social skills teaching and those kinds of things. We can end up with some very frank questions asked of us about these types of things. So I think part of the reason that we want to make sure you have an exposure to this is so that you can see some of the resources that the schools are using, and when in doubt, point a student towards their family if they're young, and when they're teenagers, if they don't feel they can talk to their family, they can talk to somewhere like Anchors, or there's other sexual health places. Talking to their doctor can be good. The big thing with that is, much like you brought forward with the principal, being the person to share about sexuality or about that part of being feminine or female, or that part of being male. There's a real power differential in that. There's huge social distance between you and the principal when you're in grade 6. And to be learning these things that are really intimate and private in some ways from that person can really change the way that you acquire that information. So going to a doctor might not be easy for a student, but it might be a good idea for a student who has questions if they don't feel like they can go to their family. Yeah, Lisa. Lisa Dawson.
I shared some words. So I have, my kids are super well versed in sex, and so I don't know what goes on with the conversations at school or anything like that, but a lot of times kids will get into my car and they will ask me things because my kids know everything. And so one of my mechanical responses all the time is, well, you know, what do your parents say before I start anything else? So that because it's not my business, really, right? So it's like, what do your parents say? And then I can expand on what they're actually really trying to ask or something when it comes to that kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. Does anybody else want to share something about their conversation?
We talked a little bit about the political nature of gender identity, you know, and that, you know, a lot of our morality in the Western cultures is derived from the Judaic text, the Bible. You know, we use the Christian version, but you know, it's Hebrew. And you know, they talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. I have Jamaican friends, male Jamaican friends, and they're very aggressive towards particularly male homosexuality. Yeah, and it's a type of intolerance, and it took me a little while to get past that, because like, oh, you know, Jehovah says this, and you know, these are the scriptures, and you know, these things aren't wrong. You know, I mean, take a closer look at that. And I got to the point where I was just like, you know, intolerance is intolerance, pretty much. I mean, if people, and in the Bible, they never talk about hermaphrodites or transgendered people. Yeah. And I think that that's a glaring omission. So what we have as a culture, and the reason we can see so many homicides on the TV per day, but you rarely see any sexual interaction beyond a kiss or, you know, an allusion or some kind of sort of a distant reference, I think does us a disservice. And I think that old, ancient morality, you know, it's not even old, it's ancient. This is 2,000, you know, 2,500 years old, and probably goes back further than that. And there may have been reasons back in the day when there could have been some different type of interactions that maybe were less than healthy. Maybe what was happening because people were forced into kind of what do you say, kind of hiding and you know, clandestine kind of activities, that there may have been an unhealthy environment around that, you know, and yeah, again, STIs might have been rampant and all sorts of, and again, possibly and probably because there wasn't enough education and these things were forced into the shadows.
Yeah, I'd like to jump off from that a little, Chris, because so I graduated high school in 1988. And one of the early jobs that I had, and I think I told you about some of the pieces with getting called out to work with kids whose parents were in treatment for drug and alcohol. But one of the other jobs that I did that I was called out to during that time was to be an AIDS palliative care person. And so I went and I took care of primarily young men who were dying of AIDS. And many, many times there was no family there. There was no mom, there was no dad. There was acquired family. There were the people that these men had made their family through acceptance and care and love and relationship. But those moms and dads weren't there, and they didn't see their boys die. And I think that coming out of that place, because I also think of men and women my parents' generation, for whom being gay was still illegal for so long in Canada, and was still in the DSM-5 as a deviance until recently. And that those people lived in fear of being caught in some way. And because it was criminal to care about somebody of your own gender. And so people who went to nightclubs or people who went to bathhouses, you know, police would raid them. And I mean, that's something that's well known in LGBTQ history. And those people weren't necessarily in the act in that moment, but they were being taken to jail because it was illegal to care about somebody, to love somebody, or have that act between those people. And so, you know, we've come through this huge transition where now we still have teachers in our school system who were young when that was happening, and they're teaching now. And so there's a lot of education that's happening from the bottom up and from these communities back into sort of the heteronormative community about what terms mean, what actual diversity looks like, the fact that Primarily people have an X and an X chromosome and an X and a Y chromosome, but there's also huge variety within that. There are people who have 5 X chromosomes and a Y chromosome. There's people who have 3 X's and a Y. You know, there's within that chromosomal understanding or that biological definition of sex, there's still diversity. It's still not binary. And so as we look at people who are transgendered, or people who are intersex, or we listen to people talk about gender identity and how that's different from sexuality and how that's different from gender expression, these are all things that I think make it a safer space for people within our communities. And that's why we have to really be careful about things like students who say, oh, that's so gay. You know, when that's a pejorative term, when they're flippantly saying that's stupid, what they're really doing is making that space not safe for anybody around them who might be questioning their own orientation. And so that would be a space where somebody wouldn't be like, oh, hey, wait a second, I might be gay. Why are you using that in that way? I mean, that doesn't happen. Generally people keep it to themselves, and it goes underground, and it becomes a place where there's less communication, there's less health, and people their lives are in danger. The first person who died from my 1988 grad class died in 1989 of AIDS. So I'd like to share with you, and for those of you who had me as an instructor in interpersonal communications, this is a little bit of a review about the gender unicorn. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with the gender unicorn. Some of you have seen the genderbread person, which is a variant on the gender unicorn. I come back to this one because I was somebody who's in the LGBTQ community shared with me that this was actually developed by trans folks, and that the genderbread person is sort of like an appropriation of this. So I kind of wanted to go back to the source on this one. So the unicorn, we're all unicorns. We're all unicorns, and we all have a gender identity, and that's what we feel on the inside is our gender. And that can be here somewhere on this 0 to very female women girl. And this is not an exclusive thing. You can have a position on all of these spectrum at the same time. So within that female to female, 0 to very male, like if you think of it in terms of what the social constructs are in our culture about what it means to be female or male or femme or butch, those kind of fall in here. Your gender identity, what you feel like on the inside. And I want to just note this lovely dotted line between each of these things, because this shows that there's connection without it being a hard connection. People have different gender expression than they do gender identity sometimes. So your gender expression, and I'm going to show you these little dots around our genderbread unicorn here. Those dots kind of represent the kind of clothing and things, or how someone might express their gender or their sense of gender. And there's people who are gender fluid, and there's people who play with gender. Someone might feel like today they feel very much like expressing their gender in a masculine way, another day in a feminine way. And you see, especially if you're in a high school setting, you're going to see lots of experimentation with this, because this is part of figuring out who we are. How do we know who we are on the inside? What is this gender identity part inside of me if I can't figure out how I fit within everything else? And so this gender expression piece might be feminine, might be really masculine, might be both, might be other of some kind, or it might not fall anywhere on that spectrum at all. One of my boys, when he was young, for about 5 years, had really, really, really long hair and was misgendered all the time as being a girl, because he had this wonderful flappy long eyelashes and like super long flowing blonde hair. And we would go places and people all the time would tell me what a lovely daughter I had. And he had told me that he was a boy, and he definitely identified and still identifies that way. But during that time, his gender expression was very feminine in terms of what our culture thinks. But for him, it was just him expressing himself. So this is where we get into the sex assigned at birth piece. This is not necessarily attached to someone's gender identity at all. It might be, it might not be. Depends on the person. Somebody who has female genitalia when they're born and are assigned female at birth and has a very feminine gender identity and gender expression would be called cisgender. So the same, cis meaning the same. Someone who has male genitalia and is assigned male at birth, and they feel like their gender identity is very masculine and their gender expression is really masculine, they would be considered cisgender as well. Thanks, Tiana. Oop, I'm gonna go back. And then there's this other place. Sometimes genitalia when a baby is born is not cut and dried. It's not necessarily penis. It's not necessarily vagina. Sometimes this changes over time as a child is growing too. And so sometimes a doctor will assign a child intersex because it's not necessarily obviously a penis or a vagina that they're born with. And that's often when they'll go into chromosomal testing to see what is expressed through somebody's genetics. And so again, yeah, hi Lisa.
Hey, what age can they do that at?
I don't know actually, chromosomal testing. I don't know, but I would assume if you have cells, they can do it.
Okay.
Yeah. So physical attraction, and this is kind of an interesting one, is not always the same as emotional attraction. So you can be emotionally attracted to people as your friends or for love or for different kinds of levels of emotional intensity, but that isn't necessarily the same as your physical attraction, that person that you find sexually desirable. Sometimes those things have big overlap and sometimes they're separate. There's it's not really reflected here in terms of physical attraction. We don't always talk about it, but asexuality or non-sexuality in terms of a group of people who are who don't really see a lot of point to the whole sex part, like the intercourse part of sex. That doesn't mean they don't have relationships and they don't have love, but maybe that piece is not part of what they are motivated to or feel naturally, and that's not really on here. But that really shows into stark relief the difference between physical attraction and emotional attraction, because somebody can want to be in a love relationship without that having sex involved in it, that sex act involved in it. So that's a whole lot to start. And if you have access to this PowerPoint, and the next page here goes into this a little bit more in terms of terminology and those definitions. But I'm going to give you a little bit of time to just sort of, now that we've talked about it a little bit in this way, I'm going to give you back spaces, and I'm going to give you the same spaces I gave you before for about 10 minutes again, and then we'll take our break. Okay? I just want to sort of talk about some of why it's so important to share the history of the LGBTQ community and how having representation is so important, you know? Because when kids and youth don't see themselves reflected in the places they want to go to, they feel like they have to forge the trail, or maybe even think that that's not even an option for them. And one of the things that I kind of wanted to share about is, some of you will be familiar with Rachel Carson. She wrote Silent Spring. In 1962, this book came out, and it started the environmental revolution. It really, really started all over the English-speaking world and then beyond, and it's been translated into so many languages. It's called Silent Spring. It came out in 1962, and it's about DDT and the effect of that pesticide or herbicide, I think it's pesticide, on all the crops and everything in North America. And it talks about how one spring it will be silent. There will be no birds because of what we're doing. And the book was so powerful, and it created this environmental movement. And one of the things that people don't know about Rachel Carson is that she was gay, and that she corresponded with the love of her life, Dorothy Freeman, who she met in 1953. And Dorothy was about 10 years older than her, was married, had a child of her own. And they wrote to each other these beautiful, passionate love letters back and forth. And sometimes they would write 2 letters, one to be read to family and one to be private. And that private letter was to be destroyed. And so again, this is back at a time when being gay was criminal. And so, you know, people don't necessarily realize that this person who is absolutely fundamental to the way that we look at our environment now in the Western world and throughout most of the world actually is from the LGBTQ community. And how powerful would that be for somebody who's young, who's like wondering about themselves, to learn that alongside that this movement is happening, you know? I think that representation is so important. So I'd love to hear what you talked about in your small groups right before the break. I know it's like 15 minutes ago.
Okay, I can go.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley.
We had a fun conversation, and it was brought up about shared bathrooms.
Oh, yes.
We had a conversation about shared bathrooms and what our comfort level is with them. And I think it was kind of unanimous that as girls, you know, when you need to unwrap things or if you want private time, having shared bathrooms is a little awkward. I don't know how anyone else feels, but worth driving 20 minutes to have privacy.
Right.
We talked about the pronouns. And you know, how maybe I'm a little bit old school, but they're new for me. And I was talking with Katie about it, and or sorry, Haley, and the idea that when someone uses the pronoun they or them, I was like, well, it's a little unusual because it kind of adds a plural nature to it. And I thought that it maybe was suggested kind of a schizophrenic, kind of a divided psychology almost. And I was like, well, that doesn't seem healthy. And then Haley mentioned, well, there's others that you can use. She's talking about one like G, G or something.
Yeah.
I think, oh, that might be better for me. Didn't know.
Yeah.
So I find that fascinating that the pronouns are evolving. And then, you know, again, Haley, who is somewhat younger than I am, mentioned that for her, it's natural. She doesn't see they as a necessarily a plural thing. And when she uses the term, she doesn't hear it that way. So I thought that was interesting too.
I don't know, some of you who know me or who have known me for a while know that I had a foster daughter, and that she came back and lived with me a summer ago with her partner. And her partner at that time was undergoing testosterone therapy and transitioning, and came here to stay with us away from Ontario for 3 months while this was starting, so that when they went home, it was kind of already in progress, and then they could come out to their mom. And so I had 3 months of using they every day and getting used to what that felt like and how that was. Because I know when I was first introduced to it, probably 5 or 6 years ago, that was definitely a struggle for me, was hearing it in that plural way, because that's how I grew up, right? I'm 50 years old, and that's my habit. And so moving into using it every day in this new way with this person for whom it matters, you know, they were misgendered all the time based on what they were wearing. And so they'd be misgendered into he, him pronouns, and they'd be misgendered into she, her pronouns based on their gender presentation. And so knowing how important it was to them, it was just part of my daily practice to make sure when I said it wrong, I apologized and I kept going, you know, he, sorry, they, you know, or she, sorry, they. And it just takes time, and not like sticking on it and being like, oh no, oh my goodness, because that just makes it harder for everybody. But just to practice. And you know what, honestly, again, I know I say this sometimes, I practice in my car when I'm by myself. I talk out loud in my car by myself to practice getting used to those words coming easily. And it just is part of the way that I get there. Sam, you had your hand up.
I was just going to say, it was kind of interesting. I was in the same group as Chris, but I had a thought when we were on the break that sometimes we sort of, like, I'm still learning about the pronouns as well too, and trying to, you know, kind of get on the right page there about it. But my dad's a paramedic, and he's been one for almost 40 years. And he's an old school kind of fellow. He's in his 70s. But he's had several transgender patients, especially in the last probably about 10 years or so.
Yep.
And I'm so proud because he really makes a hard effort to make sure that he's identifying them the correct way. And my little heart warms every time he says it, because I think that's probably not very, you know, very common for his generation, but he makes such an effort every single time. And the same thing, if he makes a mistake, he's quick to correct it and continue on. That's pretty cool.
And I would say not just for his generation, but also for the medical community. Because there's usually forms and things that have to be checked off, female, male, and there isn't always other or an accommodation of trans. Lisa.
On that note of the medical side,
yeah,
sometimes, like I get the social part of like the forms and the, you know, the change and honoring all that kind of stuff, and I'm totally on board. But what about the piece where, you know, somebody's like super in transition and they, you know, they get picked up by a paramedic for some reason, and they still at some, like for a doctor, the doctor needs to know that it's a female moving into a male kind of thing. Like where, like there's certain places and times where we need to know things that are a little bit more specific than just a social they kind of thing. Like maybe it would help with the medication that they get. Maybe they would get the right medication. Maybe they would get the wrong medication. Who knows if it's just they kind of thing at that point.
Yeah, I think that's true. And that's the conversation that would be tricky to have if you were unconscious and you were one of those people. So I don't have an answer for you about that for sure, because that's a tricky one. I do know that that there is a phenomenon, and I can't remember the name of it, but sometimes folks who are transgender who go to the emergency room don't get treated for what they come in for, because people will be like, I don't know how to treat a transgender patient. And so having a broken arm, you may be sent home with a broken arm. And I mean, I don't know how your gender has anything to do with your arm or your appendix, but I do have a loved one who was sent home 3 times with an appendix that came very close to bursting, and they ended up in emergency surgery. And it was absolutely the fact that she was transitioning at that time, and they were like, the doctors are sort of like, oh, we don't know. And that's the question. Is it discrimination or is it incompetence? What is it? Yeah, Lisa.
I'm you know, I'm just, on the other hand, is it something to do with insurance? Because it's so new. It's a whole new piece for us. It's a whole new page that we're just writing, right? So it's like how do I go in and say, like, I'm female on the inside, but I'm male, I'm, you know, transitioning to male on the outside. Will this, does it help my broken arm? You know, but it may help at certain times, right? Where there's internal things going on. And like, yeah, but it's a totally new page. And I don't think that a doctor, I don't know about doctor insurance stuff, but I don't think that they're not doing their job if they're walking away.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. And I can't see it being insurance simply, or codes, you know, being able to ascribe it for billing. I think that would be the most shallow and callous reason to turn anyone away. Not knowing how to bill it myself, but that's my personal opinion. Just to be clear, that's what I think. Yeah, so I'd like to just jump back to, unless do folks have more they want to share about their conversation before the break? Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Echo.
I don't know what class it was for, maybe it was for this class, but we watched a TED Talk the other day. I'll find it and I'll put it in the group chat. But it was like, the main idea was like, well, like maybe these things make you uncomfortable in the moment, like a little bit uncomfortable or a little bit confused or a little bit out of place. But for that person, it happens to them every day, all day, and they really care about it. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, in this TED Talk, they were just pleading to people like, please, like, try to understand how it makes me feel, and let yourself feel a little bit of discomfort once every, couple months when you're put in this situation or whatever. You know what I mean? So that's all I'd say.
Yeah, totally. And I got the opportunity a couple of weeks ago when School District 8 worked with Selkirk College to bring Desmond Cole to talk about anti-racism to all the school teachers and EAs and everybody in School District 8, and folks from all over the place attended. And got to spend some time with one of the presenters, and she showed a video in which she showed those as mosquito bites, like those little moments of microaggression as a mosquito bite. And that sometimes somebody will get a mosquito bite once every 2 or 3 days, but other people get multiple mosquito bites all day, every day. And it's a really different experience for somebody who has that experience all the time than it is for somebody once in a while. And that all builds up over time. And yeah, you can get grumpy about it because, your experience is that this is happening to you constantly. And so, having some empathy for those folks who are dealing with that on a larger scale helps a lot. So I'm just going to share with you a little bit more in this PowerPoint. So a little bit about what schools are doing to implement SOGI 123, because it's not a curriculum of its own. It is a sort of a philosophical look at, it's an angle of looking at sexual orientation and gender identity. So it's being incorporated into lessons of all ages at all different levels. And there are videos available for teachers to use, and if they want to talk about specific topics. So teacher training is happening, understanding terminology and the challenges faced historically and currently by the LGBTQ2S+ community. Because we don't know who we are unless we know where we've come from. And much like other times where we've talked about systems and systems that can be oppressive, we're still sort of growing out of an oppressive system for folks who are queer or who identify in this community. So one of the things they're doing is adding books. They're adding books to the libraries, and they're having those books available in classrooms, and ones that represent different family compositions from an anti-racist point of view, but also from an LGBTQ point of view. Integration of LGBTQ2S+ and queer positive curricular materials to all subjects. So things like history. Like if you were talking about science and you were talking about environmental science, talking about the fact that Rachel Carson was gay would be absolutely something that they could include in that as an aside, because it just rounds her out as a person. It allows us to see her as a full human in all of her aspects. And I think somebody just put something in the chat. I'm going to try and grab it here. Thanks, Jocelyn, for that video. They bring in speakers to talk about their experience, both with instructors and sometimes with the youth and the kids themselves. And SD8 recently had Ivan Coyote, who uses they, them pronouns, to talk about what their experience was with growing up in a very heteronormative community and what it was like coming out and what it is like for trans youth and non-binary youth in our communities. Lots of the schools, sorry Shelley, they've changed their bathroom signs and they are now all gender bathrooms. There's still a boys' room and a girls' room and an inclusive bathroom. So you have options. And really, if we're talking about welcoming everybody, having options is the best way to do it. So somebody can choose the bathroom that appeals to them without fear of being kicked out of it or blamed or something negative coming of it, because that absolutely happens. People are blocked from bathrooms. And then helping students to understand about language, things like "that's so gay," you know, that is really harmful for the emotional safety of students around them. And trying to help students to create safe spaces. And these are just a little handful of things that are being done. But I want to share with you, oh, actually, do I have to do it a different way? A video that is, it's about 2 minutes. And this is sort of this is a SOGI 123 video, which may or may not play for me. There it goes.
Hi, my name is True Wilson. I am a 14-year-old transgender girl. The first idea that came into my head that I was maybe transgender, I didn't know the word, but I think I was drawing a mermaid or a dress, and a boy in my class came up to me and said, "Why are you drawing that? That's a girl drawing. Only girls draw those things. You're a boy." And I'm like, well, maybe I'm not. And for the rest of the day, actually, I didn't pay attention at all in class because I was just thinking like, wait, maybe I'm not a boy. I've never heard of this before. Like, why do I feel like all of a sudden certain about this? And my mind was just racing with all these questions. Like, why do I feel this way? Like, do normal people do this? Like, is this just a phase or something? And it was a pretty confusing time for me because I was in like grade 1 or 2.
When we discovered that True's gender identity was not what her birth gender was, it was a very scary time, and to go to the school looking for support and to have them kind of turn on us, it was overwhelming and scary and sad, the complete opposite of what we needed and what our kids needed, and it was really, really hard.
When I said I have an older sister now, my teacher said you have an older brother, and I'm like, no, I have an older sister. No, Jude, you have an older brother. It felt like my teacher was the bad guy.
Since I had to go to school wearing the boys' uniform and answering to my boy pronouns and name, it was difficult for me because I couldn't focus in school. I was always worried about people are looking at me. It just made my learning experience just horrible. I had filed a human rights complaint against the Catholic School District of Vancouver. I won. We were able to make a policy that was accepting of trans youth. It just felt so good to know that the next trans person that walked into that school wouldn't have to go through the terrors and things that I had to go through.
When we left the school that we were at and we went to the school that we are now in, it was overwhelming, the joy, and it was really emotional just sitting there with the faculty members, the principal, vice principal, and having specialists there saying, what can we do in a situation that things go bad, and what can we do in a situation when things are going good? So all across the board, they were educating themselves and being proactive.
And to have it be a non-issue, to be met with, of course we're here. Whatever you need, we're here. Like that, a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. It's incredible.
Yeah. I think it's important to learn SOGI language to better support the youth. At the beginning of class, I say to all my students, I say, okay, when we do names today, I'm still getting to know you. Can you tell the rest of the class what pronouns you use? Does everyone know what I mean when I say pronouns? And almost in unison, they all kind of roll their eyes back in their head and go, yes, we know what pronouns are. We get it. We totally understand. And I go, oh. Okay, so I'll start off. My name is Mr. Adrian, and I use him and he pronouns. We go around, and without even skipping a beat, the students had no problem. When you ask someone their pronouns and they tell you, they're giving you a little bit of insight into who they are. They're sharing something with you, and it's really important to listen. For people who think that it's too hard to use they as a singular pronoun, it's really important just to practice. Often for people when they're thinking about gender, there's fluidity, there's multiplicity, so sometimes they really is the right fit for a person. Intersecting identities means that people don't move around the world with one singular identity.
The concept of intersecting identities is really beautiful. Me being gay, an immigrant, and a person of color, and I can't choose one being more important than the other part of my identity.
A lot of these things intersect and really layer in terms of the discrimination that a youth may be facing, the stereotyping a youth may be facing. And if we know the full picture, we're better able to assess what this student might need in order to uplift them in the classroom and to really change their experience and empower them.
For me, the advice I have for educators coming in on their journey on all things SOGI is to be really curious. I tell people all the time to stop and ask kids, who are you? Because teachers will say to me, what pronoun do I use when I'm talking to a gender creative kid or a gender fluid 17-year-old? And I say, ask them. It's all they want.
So that's sort of a little bit of a glimpse of some of what gets shared in terms of SOGI in school settings, but also for teachers and parents to have access to videos like that. One of the things that was mentioned in that video was around intersectionality. And so those of you who've taken interpersonal communications, and specifically with me before, know that I also talk a bit about intersectionality. And I think it's a really important piece that we understand that our identity and our experience of our social world is all of these layers of who we are as a person, all of these identities, and we are at the intersection of those experiences, and that our community and our society has expectations around each of those roles. And those expectations might change whether I'm in a professional setting, or I'm in a school setting, or I'm out in the grocery store, or I'm in the parking lot, or I'm at the movie theater. Any of those places will have different expectations around what some of those identities might mean. And that my experience comes at the intersection of those things. At night, I don't hang up the fact that I'm a parent and leave it behind. And when I go to the grocery store, I don't leave my settler mixed ancestry behind, you know? When I go out into the world, I look white and people treat me that way. And that's the same for somebody who is a different color skin tone than I do. These things are not inextricable from the person themselves and their experience in our community. And SOGI sort of starts to include that gender identity and that sexual orientation piece as part of those layered identities in a way that we don't have to hide. And I think it's really important that we remember that youth are learning this language as their first language. And it's kind of our responsibility as people who will support those youth to understand the language and to learn to speak it with them and to learn from them. I mean, asking what somebody's pronouns are, that is really respectful. It's tremendously respectful. So I talked about a few of those intersections. Disability intersects with sexuality too. And so people will have experiences in the world of being discriminated against for their sexuality, and they may also have experience of being discriminated against for their disability. And it's not like being gay only happens to people who are heterosexual. It doesn't, or not heterosexual is the wrong, you know, I'm trying to say non-disabled is where I'm trying to go with that. So I guess what I want to really connect here is that LGBTQ diversity happens across all of the other diversities of humankind. And I'm going to leave this video for you to watch on your own time. This young woman has Williams syndrome and is gay, and she talks about her experience coming out to her family and what her experience is being in the world as a gay woman with Williams syndrome, and it's well worth watching. And then finally, you know, I guess what I really would ask you to do is to think about your comfort level with all these terminologies. and to kind of assess for yourself where you are starting your work. Because for us to become more fluent in this way of looking at things and this way of talking with youth about things is going to be part of what we're doing in our work in the school settings. It's everywhere. And so identifying where you are with it and thinking about what are the things that I can start changing or learning about, or how do I approach my current level of understanding? How do I push that further out there? What are the ways that I can do that? That's all going to stand you in really good stead when you get out into the school settings. So today is about both this and about learning disabilities a little bit. But I'm going to leave the learning disabilities piece for you to do on your own time, because I think that you are able to acquire that information without the same level of facilitation. And this part is really rich to talk about because we're all coming from very different backgrounds. And so I guess I want to ask you for final words in terms of really anything that came of this for you. Was there something new? Was there something uncomfortable? Was there something really great? Was, you know, I'm just kind of curious what that, and maybe you already were familiar with it, you know?
I'll say something.
Go, Chris.
Well, I just thought it was really a powerful affirmation to look at these issues, and this is one of those ones that we tend to sweep under the rug, and it's extremely prevalent, and you know, I don't think we really even see the scope of it yet. I think we're just beginning to see this type of culture really being recognized in our community. When we were in our little groups, I spoke. Kate spoke from her experience as a South Korean, and it really is not above, what do you say, it's not on the radar there, so to speak. It's still discriminated against and not discussed, and people are have to hide that, and you know, it's very much a stigmatized in that culture. And so here we are, you know, maybe what, 20 years into it now, kind of really opening. When did the legislation change, Lisa? Do you remember?
Oh, that was really quite recent. The legislation that includes gender identity in BC changed in 2016.
Oh, see what I mean? So
yeah, yeah.
I don't think we see the scope of it yet. And this is definitely an emerging field, and something that as EAs and support workers is going to be a big thing in our experience. So I'm glad we had a chance to look at it again today. And hopefully we can, you know, I would say this. I would say whenever you've got intolerance, you've got a problem. Intolerance is intolerable. I don't think there's any room for it. You know, I think that if we can't give people the opportunity to explain and you know, let us know what is real for them, you might have challenges understanding it. You might not agree with it, you know, politically or socially. But just because you don't agree with something doesn't mean you don't tolerate it. You know, if there's a lot of things happening that we might not agree with, and we have to allow people their choice. And I think that it's really going to start to define the nature of our laws and our policies, because we have to allow people to be as they choose, regardless of what our, you know, socio-political, religious backgrounds might be, and all of the baggage that, you know, one individual might carry doesn't mean that the other person doesn't have a right to their perspective. And I think that might be a good thing for our society, and a very good thing for the types of policies we make as we go forward, because that means inclusion, and inclusion means, you know, Indigenous rights, and you know, goes to Site C Dam, you know, where everybody says no and they just ram it through. You know, even when they say they won't, you know, and here we are again. And that's why Mr. Horgan went to election too, by the way. He went to cement his ability to pull Site C and that pipeline through. And so I think it goes to all of those places and policies. And I think it was great that we had a chance to increase our ability to accept different parts of our community.
Thanks. Anybody else have any last sort of thoughts before we head out? Lisa's included in the chat here. I like the vocabulary in the video: earth, gender, non-issue, gender creative, gender fluid, intersecting identities. Great usable words. Thanks, Lisa.
I think for me, from like learning this, like from this class and stuff, and like the one big takeaway I've got from it is like, it's okay to ask, and it's okay to be like corrected and not take that into such offense. Like, okay, sorry, now I know what to call you correctly, and we're all good now. And like, I think for me, like that's been the biggest thing that I've struggled with, is like from coaching, calling a group guys, like, hey guys, like, let's go. And then people are like, I had a group where there's a couple guys, mostly girls. I'm like, hey ladies, let's go. And then it's like, don't call me a girl because I'm not a girl. I'm like, okay, friends. Okay, friends, we're going this way. Okay, like, I wanted to go say guys again, but friends or people and stuff like that. So that's one thing I've always like, I'm trying to like slowly like be conscious of it where I go and what I say, which is cool.
Yeah, my big one is I keep trying to go towards folks. I move towards folks a lot, especially because there's pieces in there that I'm learning of from the trans community around avoiding trans misogyny within the use of the word folks. So folks with an X and women with an X as opposed to with a Y. And there's some pieces in there that would take another half an hour to go over about where that comes from and how we got there. But I'm definitely making my efforts there in terms of my group conversation to refer to and ask folks and friends to be part of my team, you know. Yeah. Lisa says, hey, in sports, I use my team name. Hey, Jackrabbits. I like Jackrabbits. Anyone else have anything they want to share with us today? Excellent. Well, I think I want to say thanks. Thanks for being part of the conversation and being courageous and being ready to share with each other. I feel like I miss out on so much by not being able to just wander around the classroom, because I would get to benefit from all of your perspectives too. So thank you, and thank you for thinking about this, you know, and growing your awareness wherever you're starting from. And I mean, we're all on a trajectory, right? You know, so recognizing where we are on that trajectory and moving forward from there is wonderful. And that's all I could ever ask of anybody as a student, and myself included in that. So thanks. And with that, I will let you get on with your afternoon. And I just want to say thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.